Greetings. I'm Steve Shields, author of Divergent Paths of the Restoration, 5th edition, an encyclopedia of the Smith-Rigdon movement, published in 2021 by Signature Books of Salt Lake City. Today, I want to talk about the Smith-Rigdon movement. When the book first came out, several people questioned what that meant. Shouldn't it be the Smith-Cowdery movement? And I argue that Cowdery was a minor player. He did not have a major role. He did not shape the thought or the development of the church in any way. He was a scribe. Even which was later described as the, quote, restoration of the Aaronic priesthood, end quote, apparently didn't happen that way. Nothing was ever said in 1829 about Aaronic priesthood or restoration or whatever. Even the story about how, in reading the Book of Mormon about baptism, wondered where the authority came from. That was all a later interpolation. Nobody in those early few years of Joseph Smith's little church had ever heard that story. The early documents that are in the Doctrine and Covenants don't talk about that. In fact, the only time Joseph Smith used the terms restoration in the Doctrine and Covenants has to do with the restoration of the house of Israel and had nothing to do with restoring the original church or the ancient gospel. Joseph talks a lot about the great and marvelous work about to come forth. And that great and marvelous work was the Book of Mormon. Those revelations that he produced come before the publication of the book. So the great and marvelous work was not organizing a church. It was not claiming priesthood authority, being restored to the earth, having been lost. All of those stories were later interpolations. And I would suggest that it was Sidney Rigdon who brought that whole concept into Joseph Smith's way of thinking. Rigdon has been much despised in the histories that have been written since the period of at Nauvoo. He was basically written out of the history of the church by people who didn't like him anymore. He was not perhaps as faithful as they wished he would have been when Joseph Smith was killed. In fact, he'd already moved away from Nauvoo because he and Joseph had had somewhat of a personal falling out. And you can read about that in many histories that have been written and studied about that. But one thing that Sidney Rigdon always remained faithful to was his testimony of Joseph Smith as a prophet, especially in the early years, his belief in the Book of Mormon, and that continued with him until he died in the 1870s. So why call this the Smith-Rigdon movement? For me, there's a lot of reasons, and I want to suggest to the listeners that you look at Dialogue Volume 52, the fall 2019 issue, where my paper, Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon, co-founders of a movement, was published. Fall of 2019, I think I said that. To call the movement Mormonism is confusing. Even though Mormon and Mormonite were among the earliest nicknames to appear, a French scholar proposed referring to the movement as Mormonisms in the plural, because he argued that the term Mormonism was widely understood and would be helpful in academics to describe it. However, many of the expressions in the movement don't identify with the term, mainly because it has pretty much been co-opted by the Salt Lake City-based LDS Church. Latter-day Saint movement, which even I have used in the past, is really quite anachronistic when you start thinking about the history of the church, whether it began in 1820, 1829, or 1830. The phrase was introduced to the movement late in 1833 by Sidney Rigdon. And in modern times, as with Mormonism, many of the expressions of the movement don't identify with the phrase Latter-day Saint, because again, it was co-opted by the two largest groups for so many years. The label Restoration Movement is a retrospective gloss on, and it introduces confusion as well, because when we anachronistically apply something from a later understanding, we misunderstand what Joseph Smith was doing and what he commonly called his church, the great and marvelous work, as I mentioned earlier. But the term Restoration Movement applies to Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone and others, and even before them. They were in the early 1800s. There were restoration movements even before that. So the terms restore and restoration that seem commonplace in what is called Mormon studies, what I call the Smith-Rigdon movement, it was borrowed from the Reformed Baptist movement, the Stone-Campbell movement, as it's called academically, from the early 1820s. Sidney Rigdon was a key leader in that movement, and many other leaders came with him when they merged with Joseph Smith, and they introduced that broader language. Joseph Smith's appellation as the restorer, the term restored gospel as applied to Smith's founding experiences, all post-date those times. They were all added on top of that later. The earliest Ohio members of the new movement continued to call themselves disciples, at least until the church name was formally changed in 1834. Early on, when they met, Sidney Rigdon was, give me just a minute to get my notes organized here. If you look at Doctrine and Covenants 84 and 85, or Salt Lake City editions 77, 86, and 88, Joseph Smith never uses the term restore or restoration to suggest that he's understanding himself to be restoring either the gospel or an organization. Those are key expressions of his that need to be taken into consideration. Sidney Rigdon's importance to the movement can't be overemphasized. When Smith and Rigdon met in 1830, they formed a partnership resulting in a merger of two independent communities. Joseph Smith's in New York and Pennsylvania, which had a few hundred members at most, and Sidney Rigdon's community in Ohio, which had 1,000 or more members and was highly organized with designated ministry, preachers, pastors, bishops. It took a few months for the followers of Rigdon to begin to believe in the new revelation represented by the Book of Mormon. The Doctrine and Covenants and other sources clearly demonstrate that Sidney Rigdon was not second to Joseph Smith, but an equal partner. The problem is that from our modern perspective, by the time Joseph Smith was killed, he had become disenchanted with Rigdon, and likewise the reverse was true. The cancellation of the Common Stock Association, the Kirtland Bank debacle, and the repeated failures to establish Zion as a communitarian society were very discouraging to Rigdon. That's what he had brought to the movement, and that was one of the appeals of many of his followers who joined up with the new movement. Joseph Smith's work, his great and marvelous work, began taking shape by May of 1829 in New York and Pennsylvania with the first baptisms that were done. Of course, the foundations had been years in the making, but the founding event of the new church was the Book of Mormon. And the change in that founding event to where the first vision became preeminent didn't happen for decades after Joseph Smith's death. What Smith and his followers did on April 6, 1830 was organize a religious association to be legally recognized to perform marriages. It was not an incorporation, it was simply following the laws of New York State so they could perform legal marriages. They weren't forming a denomination according to our modern understanding. That was counter to the ideas of Smith, Rigdon, and many others. Denomination was not something that should be. The church was always in the local sense. And I think that might be why once the early Latter-day Saint church in the 1830s began to start growing, they kept calling the other churches branches rather than churches. They were branches of one single church. It still didn't have an idea that there was a denominational structure. In 1821, Sidney Rigdon's brother-in-law, Adamson Bentley, introduced Rigdon to Alexander Campbell. Historians consider that meeting to be the beginning of the Campbell movement. Rigdon and Campbell quickly became associates, very close. Rigdon was known as one of the most successful and eloquent leaders in Campbell's movement. Some scholars consider Sidney Rigdon, Walter Scott, Adamson Bentley, and Alexander Campbell as the co-founders of the movement that gave birth to what is now known academically as the Stone-Campbell movement. The Mahoning Baptist Association, which was formed in 1820, was an alliance of like-minded ministers and congregations that were the nucleus for the later development of the disciples movement with Campbell. In the earliest years, they were called Reformed Baptist. The Mahoning Association functioned in some ways as a micro-denomination, maybe like a district in the modern denominational sense. There were dozens of such associations in the United States at the time. They were all fairly regional. They held annual conferences. They appointed ministers to certain tasks, certain areas. They declared common doctrinal statements. Sidney Rigdon was one of the bishops of the Mahoning Baptist Association, and he supervised several congregations northwest of Warren, Ohio. In 1828, Bentley was the leader, supervising several congregations near Warren. Scott was in charge south of Warren, and Rigdon became the leader northwest of Warren. Campbell was the scholar and the writer. Walter Scott claimed to have restored the ancient gospel, but Campbell rejected that claim. Rigdon and Campbell parted company in the summer of 1830 over issues dealing with the role of charismata and setting up communitarian societies. In August, I think it was, of 1830, Rigdon and his communitarian groups separated from Campbell and began working independently. Campbell rejected what they were doing. Sidney Rigdon though, has still been identified as by some historians as one of the three witnesses, that's a specific term, to the restoration of the ancient order of things. The primary holders of the title are Alexander Campbell and Walter Scott. When Rigdon met Smith, Joseph Smith Jr., Smith declared that Rigdon was like John the Baptist and appointed him as a spokesperson. Interestingly, the same language was already being used to describe Barton Stone in the other movement. Sidney Rigdon is mentioned by name in dozens of sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, many of which were jointly received by the two men. Some of the earliest believers in the Book of Mormon had been disciples trained by Sidney Rigdon as ministers and church leaders. When Rigdon finally accepted baptism late in 1830 and traveled to New York, stayed for several weeks through the winter. The Smith-Rigdon partnership merged two distinct religious communities and created a new one that contained features of both. They built on those foundations. Neither leader gave up cherished basic principles. Rigdon brought communalism and a fervent belief in the gifts of the Spirit. Smith had the new revelation, Book of Mormon, and continuing oracles from God. Rigdon brought a refined understanding of the Bible and theology. Each leader contributed to the newly shaped church body ideas and skills the other lacked. Sidney was well-spoken, he was educated, and experienced as a church leader. He was appointed to be Smith's principal advisor and spokesperson by revelation. He brought hundreds of his followers into the new church, including Orson Pratt, who is recognized as the first systematic theologian of the new movement. Other disciples who followed Rigdon into the movement were Orson Pratt's brother Parley, Edward Partridge, Newell K. Whitney, Isaac Morley, Orson Hyde, John Murdoch, Eliza R. Snow, all of whom became very key people in the church. John Corrill, William McClellan, John Boynton, Lyman White, Levi Hancock, Zebedee Coltrane, Luke and Lyman Johnson, and Sylvester Smith, John Johnson. They'd all been Rigdon's people. One half of the original 12 apostles in the new church had been Rigdon's disciples. The Pratt brothers and Orson Hyde had been Campbellite preachers, and the key people who helped articulate the theology of the new church in the early years of the movement, there were four of them. One was Joseph Smith, the other three were Campbellites or disciples, Sidney Rigdon, Parley Pratt, and Orson Pratt. Rigdon delivered every major speech or sermon in the first decade of the church's history. He dealt with faith, repentance, baptism, spiritual gifts, the millennium, and communitarianism. The early church's periodicals are replete with notes and prayers and texts and comments by Rigdon. He outlined the basic theology of the movement in his lectures of faith that were used for missionary training and canonized as equal to the revelations in the 1835 first edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. He laid the foundations of what have become, for some denominations in the movement, essential temple ritual. To discount or deny Rigdon's contributions because of his later rockier relationship with Smith and his refusal to agree with Brigham Young would require a complete reinterpretation of the entire canon of scripture of the movement, except perhaps the Book of Mormon. Smith and Rigdon's first joint project, as many know, was revising the Bible. Although Smith had begun it a few months earlier, it had languished. And now, with these two partners, they worked almost daily on the Bible project. The idea of problems with the King James Version of the text were commonplace. There's little question that Rigdon was well informed and likely made use of Alexander Campbell's 1826 revision of the New Testament. Scholars grounded in first century Greek commonly agreed the King James Version was not reliable in every case. Between the 1770s and early 1830s, some 500 different editions of the Bible or New Testament had been published in the United States alone. While they were working on the Bible revision through the early spring of or late winter of 1831, the idea of moving the entire church to Ohio came up. Joseph Smith's elaboration on the prophecy of Enoch in the inspired version of the Bible, Genesis 7, Pearl of Great Price, Moses 7, spoke directly to Rigdon's yearnings for what Rigdon believed to be a restoration of New Testament communitarianism. The church was struggling in New York, but booming in Ohio. Many of the early church members in New York were prosperous landowners and farmers that didn't want to be uprooted, however. But persuasively, Smith pronounced a revelation directing church members to assemble in Ohio, D&C 37, December of 1830. And he declared, God is about to destroy this generation, and Christ will descend from heaven in power and great glory. Kirtland was Rigdon's city, and while the church headquarters remained there, the basic structure of the church was developed. Priesthood offices, leading quorums were all developed in Rigdon's city of Kirtland, Ohio. A further confirmation of Rigdon's equal status is found in section 76 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Important evidence of his status. Rigdon was the only other person besides Smith who claimed to have conversed with Christ. That's an important historical marker. Other confirmation is found in D&C 87 or Salt Lake City 90, dated March 8, 1833. The text declares that both Sidney Rigdon and Frederick G. Williams are accounted as equal with Joseph Smith in holding the keys of this last kingdom. Williams, as noted earlier, was also a former disciple. As Zion's camp was assembling at Kirtland in the spring of 1834, Rigdon preached a sermon to the recruits on May 3rd and announced that the prophet and the High Council had agreed to his suggestion to change the name of the church from the Church of Christ to the Church of the Latter-day Saints, emphasizing the proximity of the millennium. It was by this name that the church published the first edition of the Doctrine and Covenants in 1835 and was inscribed on the entablature of the Kirtland Temple. Sidney Rigdon ordained Joseph Smith to the office of President of the High Priesthood when that was introduced into the church. The suggestion came from Sidney. His influence over the identity, mission, message, beliefs, and organizational structure of the church was disconcerting to some of Joseph's earlier group members. David Whitmer complained loudly that Rigdon finally persuaded Brother Joseph to believe that the high priests who had such great power in ancient times should be in the church today. He had Brother Joseph inquire of the Lord about it, and they received an answer according to their desires. Sidney Rigdon was one of the best educated members of the church, according to book learning. Late in 1832, instruction was given to set up a school to teach the priesthood, variously called School of the Elders or School of the Prophets. Rigdon was the chief teacher. The curriculum included religious topics and grammar and reading, writing, history, geography, foreign language. None of this was new to Rigdon. He was an experienced teacher and trainer of ministers. One of the most important contributions to that identity was Rigdon's preparation of the 7-part series of theological lectures to a group of prospective missionaries during the 1834-35 winter term. Rigdon's lectures were canonized in the 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants and designated by the First Presidency as the doctrine of the Church. The lectures had equal scriptural status, according to that, with the revelations in Part 2. Community of Christ dropped the Lectures of Faith in 1897, and the LDS Church dropped them in 1921. Rigdon had produced the first written theology, and later the histories became changed to suggest that Joseph Smith had written them. The Kirtland Temple was perhaps Rigdon's longest lasting visible project. When the building was dedicated, Rigdon co-presided with Joseph Smith and gave a lengthy dedicatory address, which lasted about 3 hours. He introduced the ordinance of washing of feet as a remnant of Sandemanian theology from Rigdon's late 1820s ministry with Walter Scott in Pittsburgh. 2 days after the dedication of the temple, the foot washing ceremony was performed in solemn assembly. And Rigdon first washed the prophet's feet. Smith then reciprocated, after which the ordinances was performed for the rest of the group by Smith and Rigdon. Richard S. Van Wagner noted, Mormonism in its purest distillation is the fused product of Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon's revolutionary thinking condensed into the prophet's revelations. I think that Smith-Rigdon movement is an appropriate name academically to refer to the movement, and we ought to have Smith-Rigdon studies rather than Mormon studies, which often is co-opted by one denomination in particular. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll buy a copy of the book and see a little bit more about what I'm talking about. Thank you.